She was bleeding out in a burned wagon, her husband's body still warm beside her, when the Apache warrior found her. Jane Langford had maybe an hour left before the Sonoran sun finished what the Comancheros had started. But what she whispered to him in that moment, a desperate promise that would bind them together in ways neither could predict, would change both their lives forever. The attack had come at dawn, 3 days south of Tucson in the New Mexico territory. Jane and Thomas Langford had been hauling supplies to Fort Bowie when 15 Comanchero raiders, half Mexican outlaws and half renegade Comanches, descended on their wagon train like locusts. Thomas had fought hard, his rifle barking until a lance punched through his chest. Jane had grabbed his pistol and dropped 2 raiders before a bullet tore through her side, spinning her into the wagon bed where she collapsed among scattered flour sacks and shattered crates. When the shooting stopped, the Comancheros took what they wanted: horses, weapons, whiskey, and rode south toward the border, leaving the dead where they lay. Jane had crawled from the wreckage, pressing her hand against the wound in her side, feeling the hot blood pulse between her fingers. She tried to reach Thomas, but he was already gone, his eyes staring up at nothing. The other wagons in their small train were burning, black smoke rising into the pale morning sky. Everyone was dead. The Hendersons, the O'Malleys, young Billy Pritchard, who'd just turned 17. All of them scattered across the desert floor like broken dolls. Jane dragged herself back to the wagon and propped herself against a wheel, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The bullet had gone clean through, but she was losing blood fast. Her dress was soaked red from waist to hem, and her vision kept blurring at the edges. She knew she was dying. She'd seen enough death on the frontier to recognize it when it came for her. The sun climbed higher, turning the desert into a furnace. Vultures began to circle overhead, patient and knowing. She thought about Thomas, about the life they'd planned together in California, the orange groves they'd dreamed of planting, the children they'd never have. All of it was gone now, burned away in a few minutes of gunfire and screaming. That's when she heard the horse. A single rider, moving slow and cautious through the wreckage. Jane's hand fumbled for the pistol at her side, but her fingers wouldn't close around the grip. She squinted through the heat shimmer and saw him. An Apache warrior, bare-chested and painted for war, his long black hair tied back with a red cloth. He rode a paint horse, and a Winchester rifle rested across his thighs. For a moment, Jane thought she was already dead, and this was some kind of fever dream. But then the warrior dismounted and walked toward her, his moccasins silent on the hard-packed earth. "Please," Jane whispered, her voice cracking like dried leather. "Please don't leave me here." The warrior stopped 10 feet away, studying her with dark, unreadable eyes. He was young, maybe 30, with high cheekbones and a scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw. He wore buckskin leggings and a medicine bag hung from his neck. War paint striped his chest, red and black symbols Jane didn't understand. For a long moment, he said nothing, just watched her bleed. Jane could see him calculating, weighing whether she was worth the trouble. "You're Apache," Jane said, her words slurring together. "I know your people. I know you have honor. I'm begging you. Don't let me die like this." The warrior's expression didn't change. He'd seen plenty of white settlers die, watched their wagons burn, and their bodies rot in the sun. Most Apache would have ridden past without a second glance. The white man's war wasn't his war. Their deaths weren't his concern. But something in Jane's eyes, not fear, but defiance, a fierce refusal to beg for mercy she didn't expect, made him pause. "Why should I help you?" He said in perfect English, his voice low and rough. "Your people kill mine. Take our land. Drive us into the mountains like animals." Jane's laugh was bitter and wet with blood. "My people," she said. "My husband is dead. My friends are dead. I have no people anymore. I'm just a woman dying in the dirt, asking another human being for help." The warrior's jaw tightened. He'd been tracking the Comancheros for 2 days, ever since they'd raided a small Apache camp and stolen horses. He'd found their trail heading north and followed it here, expecting to find them. Instead, he found this. White settlers massacred and left for the buzzards. The Comancheros didn't care who they killed. Apache, Mexican, white, it didn't matter. They were a plague on the land. What's your name? He asked. Jane, she whispered. Jane Langford. He nodded once. I am Taima. It means thunder. He knelt beside her and examined the wound. The bullet had punched through her side, just above her hip. It was bad but not fatal if he could stop the bleeding. He pulled a leather pouch from his belt and opened it, revealing a thick paste made from yarrow root and sage. Apache medicine used to clot blood and fight infection. His grandmother had taught him the recipe when he was just a boy. This will hurt, Taima said. Jane nodded, biting down on her lip as he packed the wound with the paste. The pain was white-hot, like being shot all over again, but she didn't scream. She couldn't afford to waste the breath. Taima worked quickly, his hands surprisingly gentle for a warrior. He tore strips from her petticoat and bound the wound tight, wrapping the cloth around her waist until the bleeding slowed. When he finished, he sat back on his heels and looked at her. Sweat beaded on Jane's forehead despite the shade, and her skin had gone pale as milk. You are strong, he said. Most white women would have died already. Jane's smile was weak but genuine. I'm too stubborn to die easy. My mother always said I was born fighting. Taima stood and walked to his horse, returning with a canteen. He held it to her lips and let her drink, just a few small sips. Too much water too fast would make her sick. Jane's eyes fluttered closed, and for a moment, Taima thought she'd passed out. But then she spoke, her voice barely audible. Come back quickly, she whispered. You know why. Taima frowned. I'm not leaving you. Jane's eyes opened, and they were fierce despite the pain. Yes, you are. You're going to track those Comancheros. You're going to kill them for what they did. And then you're going to come back here and take me somewhere safe. Because if you don't, I'll die. And you'll have to live knowing you could have saved me but didn't. Taima stared at her, stunned. This woman, bleeding and broken, half dead from blood loss, was giving him orders. Most white women he'd encountered were either terrified of him or treated him like an animal. But Jane Langford looked at him like an equal. And why would I come back? He asked, testing her. Jane's hand reached out and grabbed his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so close to death. Because I'll make you a promise, she said. Save me, protect me, and I'll stay with you. However long you want. Wherever you go. I'll be yours. No questions. No complaints. Just say yes, and I'm yours. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and impossible. Taima had never taken a white woman. Apache warriors who did were often cast out, considered traitors to their people. But Jane wasn't offering herself out of desperation or fear. She was offering a trade, her life and her loyalty in exchange for his protection. It was practical, calculated, and strangely honorable. You don't know what you're saying, Taima said, his voice rough. Heat and blood loss are making you talk crazy. I know exactly what I'm saying, Jane replied, her green eyes boring into his. I have nothing left. No husband. No family. No home. All I have is me. And I'm choosing to give that to you if you'll have it. I'll cook for you. Clean for you. Warm your bed at night. Whatever you need. Just don't leave me here to die. Taima looked down at her, this strange white woman with fire in her eyes and blood on her dress. He should have ridden away. Should have left her to die and continued tracking the Comancheros alone. But something in her words, the raw honesty, the fierce determination, stirred something in him he thought he'd buried years ago. I'll come back. he said quietly. "I'll hurry back." Jane's smile was radiant despite the pain. "Then I'll be waiting. And when you return, I'll keep my promise." Taima mounted his horse and rode south, following the Comancheros' trail into the desert. Behind him, Jane Langford lay in the shadow of the burned wagon, her hand pressed to the wound in her side, her heart pounding with something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite hope. She'd made a promise to a man she didn't know, offered herself to an Apache warrior in exchange for her life. And now all she could do was wait and pray he'd keep his word. The sun climbed higher, turning the desert into an oven. Jane drifted in and out of consciousness, her dreams filled with fire and blood and the sound of Taima's voice saying, "I'll hurry back." Hours passed. The vultures circled lower, their shadows crossing her face. And Jane wondered if she'd just traded one death for another. What did she really know about this Apache warrior? Nothing, except that he'd stopped to help her when he had no reason to. That had to count for something. Taima rode hard, his paint horse eating up the miles with long ground-covering strides. The Comancheros' trail was easy to follow. They were moving slow, weighted down by stolen goods, and too confident to cover their tracks. Taima had grown up hunting these badlands, knew every canyon and dry wash, every water hole and hidden spring. He'd find them before sundown. The question was what he'd do when he did. As he rode, he thought about Jane Langford. She was brave, he'd give her that. Most white women would have wept and pleaded, begged for mercy with tears and prayers to their Christian God. But Jane had looked him in the eye and made him a deal, cold and practical as a horse trade. There was something almost Apache about that, the willingness to bargain with fate, to offer what you had in exchange for what you needed. His people understood that kind of transaction. Respect was earned through strength and honesty, not tears, but taking her as his woman, that was complicated. Taima had been married once, to a Chiricahua woman named Morning Dove. She'd been beautiful and fierce, with a laugh that could make the stars shine brighter. She died 3 winters ago, killed by Mexican slavers during a raid on their winter camp. Taima had tracked those slavers for 2 months, killing them one by one until none remained. Since then, he'd lived alone, moving between Apache camps, hunting and scouting for various bands. He had no family left, no ties to any particular group. He was what the white men called a lone wolf, and he'd been content with that until now. Until a dying white woman had looked at him with those fierce green eyes and said, "I'll be yours." Taima shook his head, pushing the thoughts away. First, he had to deal with the Comancheros. Then he'd decide what to do about Jane Langford. Maybe she'd be dead when he returned. Maybe the desert would solve his problem for him. But even as he thought it, he knew he didn't want that. Something about her had gotten under his skin. He found them 2 hours later, camped in a box canyon near the Rio Grande. 15 men, just like Jane had said, sprawled around a fire, drinking stolen whiskey and laughing about the morning's raid. Their horses were picketed nearby, and the stolen goods were piled in the center of camp like offerings to some dark god. Taima dismounted and left his horse hidden in a wash, then moved closer on foot, silent as smoke drifting through the rocks. The Comancheros were careless, drunk on victory and liquor. No sentries, no one watching the canyon rim. They thought themselves safe this far south, close to the border where law meant nothing. Taima counted them, memorizing faces and positions. He recognized the leader, a half-breed named Santos Cruz, wanted in 3 territories for murder and slave trading. Cruz was the worst kind of outlaw, brutal and smart, with enough Apache blood to make him dangerous and enough Mexican cruelty to make him feared. Taima had heard stories about Cruz, how he'd once burned an entire village just to watch it die. Taima waited until full dark, watching the Comancheros pass around bottles of whiskey and mezcal, their voices growing louder and less cautious with each drink. Then he made his move. He slipped into camp like a shadow, his knife already in his hand. The first man died without a sound, Taima's blade opening his throat from ear to ear. The second woke up just in time to see death coming, but not in time to scream. Taima moved through the camp like a ghost, killing quickly and quietly, until only 5 men remained around the fire. Then he stood and fired his Winchester into the air. The camp exploded into chaos. Men scrambled for weapons, shouting in Spanish and English, and bastardized Apache. But Taima was already moving, circling around the camp's perimeter, firing from different positions, making them think they were surrounded by a war party. One man ran for the horses and took a bullet in the back, dropping face first into the dirt. Another tried to climb out of the canyon and fell screaming when Taima's shot shattered his leg. The man's cries echoed off the canyon walls, adding to the confusion. Santa's Cruz rallied his remaining men, 3 hardened killers who'd survived more fights than most men could count. They formed a defensive circle, backs to the fire, weapons ready and pointing out into the darkness. "Show yourself, you coward," Cruz shouted into the night. "Fight like a man, not a skulking coyote." Taima's voice came from the shadows, cold and mocking. "You want a fair fight? Like the one you gave those settlers this morning? Women and old men shot down like dogs while they begged for mercy?" Cruz's face went pale. "Apache," he hissed, recognition and fear mixing in his voice. "Yes," Taima said, stepping into the firelight with his rifle leveled at Cruz's heart. "And you killed my people 2 days ago. Stole our horses. Shot a boy who was only 12 years old while he tried to protect his sister." Cruz's eyes narrowed, calculating odds. "So this is revenge. Apache revenge for Apache dead." Taima smiled, and it was not a kind expression. "No, this is justice. For my people and for those settlers you butchered. You're a rabid dog, Cruz, and rabid dogs get put down." The gunfight lasted maybe 30 seconds. Cruz and his men were fast, experienced killers who'd lived by the gun for decades. But Taima was faster. When the smoke cleared, all 4 Comancheros lay dead or dying in the dirt. Taima walked among them, finishing the wounded with quick, merciful shots to the head. He took no pleasure in it, but he felt no remorse either. These men had chosen their path, and that path had led here. He gathered the stolen horses and loaded them with supplies from the Comanchero camp. Medicine, food, blankets, ammunition. Then he set fire to the camp, watching as the flames consumed the bodies and the blood-soaked ground. By morning, there'd be nothing left but ash and bones. He rode back north, pushing hard through the night, changing horses twice to keep up the pace. Jane Langford was waiting, and he promised to hurry back. Taima didn't break his promises. Dawn was breaking when Taima returned to the burned wagons. He half expected to find Jane dead, her body cold and stiff, picked over by vultures and coyotes. But as he rode closer, he saw her sitting up, her back against the wagon wheel, her hand still pressed to her side. She looked up as he approached, and despite the pain etched into her face, despite the fever flush on her cheeks, her smile was like the sun rising over the mountains. "You came back," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. "I said I would," Taima replied, dismounting. He knelt beside her and checked her wound. The bleeding had stopped completely, and the Apache medicine had done its work. The flesh around the bullet hole was red and angry, but not black with infection. She'd live if he could get her to shelter and keep her wound clean for the next week. Jane's hand reached out and touched his face, her fingers gentle on his scarred cheek. The touch was surprisingly intimate, and Taima felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't felt in 3 long years. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for coming back. Thank you for not leaving me here to die alone." Taima nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The gratitude in her eyes was real, but so was something else. Recognition, perhaps. Or understanding. "Can you ride?" he asked. Jane gritted her teeth and nodded. I can do whatever I have to do. I'm not going to slow you down, I promise. Tima helped her to her feet, supporting her weight as she swayed. She was lighter than he expected, hollowed out by blood loss and dehydration. He lifted her onto his horse as gently as he could, then swung up behind her, holding her steady against his chest. Jane leaned back into him, her body relaxing for the first time in hours. Tima could feel her heart beating, rapid and weak, against his arm. "Where are we going?" she asked. "North," Tima said. "To the mountains. I know a place. An old miner's cabin near a stream. It's abandoned now, but it's sound. We'll be safe there while you heal." Jane nodded, her eyes already closing. "And after I'm healed? After I can walk and work again?" Tima was quiet for a long moment, his arms tight around her as the horse started walking. "After you're healed," he said softly, "we'll see if you still want to keep your promise. You might feel different when you're not dying. Most people do." Jane's hand covered his where it rested on her stomach, just above the bandages. Her voice was fierce despite her exhaustion. "I'll keep it," she said. "I told you. I'm yours now. For as long as you want me. I don't say things I don't mean, Tima. That's not who I am." And as they rode into the rising sun, Tima wondered if saving Jane Langford's life had been the bravest thing he'd ever done, or the most foolish. Because somewhere between finding her in that burned wagon and carrying her away into the mountains, something had changed. And when she whispered, "Come back quickly," you know why, she'd bound him to her in ways that had nothing to do with promises or deals. And everything to do with something he'd thought died with Morning Dove 3 winters ago. His heart had started beating again. And Jane Langford, broken and bleeding and fierce as a desert storm, had brought it back to life. As they climbed into the foothills, leaving the burned wagons and the dead behind, Tima realized that his life had just changed in ways he couldn't yet understand. He'd saved a white woman's life, and in doing so, he'd made her his responsibility. The question was whether that responsibility would become something more. Whether the promise she'd made in desperation would transform into something neither of them expected. Love, perhaps. Or something even more dangerous. The cabin sat in a hidden valley, surrounded by pine trees and fed by a cold mountain stream. Tima had found it 2 years ago while tracking elk, an old prospector's shelter abandoned when the silver ran out. The roof was sound, the walls solid, and best of all, it was miles from any settlement or army patrol. As they approached, Jane's fever had climbed higher, her skin burning against Tima's chest despite the cool mountain air. He carried her inside and laid her on the narrow cot, the only furniture the prospector had left behind. Jane's eyes were half closed, her breathing shallow and rapid. The wound wasn't infected yet, but it would be soon if he didn't act fast. Tima built a fire in the stone hearth and set water to boil, then began gathering supplies from his medicine bag. He'd need fresh yarrow, some willow bark for the fever, and clean cloth for new bandages. For 3 days, Jane burned with fever. She thrashed and moaned, calling out names Tima didn't recognize. Thomas, her dead husband. Someone named Catherine, maybe his sister. Once she screamed about fire and blood, reliving the Kamankaro attack in her delirium. Tima stayed by her side, changing the bandages twice a day, forcing water and willow bark tea between her cracked lips. He'd seen men die from wounds less severe than hers, watched fever consume them from the inside out. But Jane was strong, stronger than most men he'd known. On the 4th morning, the fever broke. Tima woke to find Jane's eyes open and clear, watching him from the cot. He was sitting on the floor beside her, his back against the wall, his Winchester across his knees. He hadn't slept more than a few hours in days, catching brief moments of rest between checking her wound and feeding her medicine. "You look terrible," Jane said, her voice hoarse but steady. Tima almost smiled. You look worse." She laughed, then winced as the movement pulled at her stitches. "How long?" she asked. 4 days since we got here. 7 since I found you." Jane's hand moved to her side, touching the fresh bandages. "You stayed with me the whole time." "It wasn't a question. Someone had to make sure you didn't die. You made me a promise, remember? Can't keep promises if you're dead." Jane's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away. "I remember. I remember everything I said." Tima stood and moved to the fire, ladling soup from the pot hanging over the flames. It was simple fare, rabbit and wild onions, but it would help her regain strength. "You need to eat," he said, bringing the bowl to her. Jane tried to sit up, but her arms shook with the effort. Tima slipped his arm behind her shoulders, supporting her weight as he held the spoon to her lips. She ate slowly, each swallow an effort, but she finished half the bowl before shaking her head. "That's all I can manage." Tima lowered her back to the cot. "You'll eat more tonight. And tomorrow. Every day until you're strong again." Jane caught his hand as he turned away. "Why are you doing this? You could have left me at the wagons. Could have taken your revenge on the Comancheros and ridden away. Why save me?" Tima looked down at their joined hands, her pale fingers wrapped around his darker ones. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe because you didn't beg. Maybe because you looked at me like I was a man, not a savage. Or maybe because I'm tired of being alone." Jane squeezed his hand. "I'm still going to keep my promise. When I'm well, when I can work again, I'll stay with you. I'll be whatever you need me to be." Tima pulled his hand away, suddenly uncomfortable. "You don't owe me anything. I saved you because it was the right thing to do, not because I wanted payment. I know that," Jane said firmly. "That's exactly why I want to keep my word. You didn't ask for anything. You just helped. That makes you different from every other man I've ever known, including my husband." Tima's eyebrows rose. "You didn't love him, Thomas?" Jane's expression grew distant. "I loved him once. Or thought I did. But he married me because his family needed my father's land. I was part of a business arrangement, not a love match. He was kind enough, but he never really saw me. Just saw what I could do for him. And you think I see you?" Tima asked. Jane met his eyes without flinching. "I think you see me more clearly than anyone ever has. You see someone who's strong enough to survive. Someone who keeps her word. That's more than most people ever saw." Tima turned back to the fire, unsettled by her honesty. He'd expected gratitude, maybe fear, possibly resentment. But this fierce determination to honor her promise, this insistence that she belonged to him now, it stirred something in his chest he wasn't ready to name. Over the next week, Jane grew stronger. She could sit up on her own, then stand with Tima's help. He'd catch her trying to walk when she thought he wasn't looking, wobbling on unsteady legs before collapsing back onto the cot. "You'll tear the stitches," he warned her on the 5th day of her recovery. "I need to get stronger," Jane insisted. "I can't just lie here forever." Tima knelt beside the cot, his expression serious. "You almost died. Your body needs time to heal. Another week, maybe 2, and then you can start doing more." Jane's frustration was evident, but she nodded. "I'm not used to being helpless. Even after Thomas and I married, I worked. Hauled water, chopped wood, helped with the horses. I've never been the kind of woman who sits idle." Tima studied her face, seeing the truth in her words. She wasn't like the soft-town women he'd seen in Tucson, pampered and useless. Jane had calluses on her hands, muscles in her arms from hard work. She was a frontier woman, built for survival. "Tell me about Morning Dove," Jane said one evening as they sat by the fire. Tima had mentioned his dead wife once during Jane's fever, and she'd remembered. He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "What do you want to know?" Jane shifted on the cot, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Did you love her?" Tima nodded. "From the time we were children. She could outrun any boy in our band, outshoot most of them too. She had a laugh that sounded like water over stones, bright and clear." "How did she die?" Jane asked softly. Tima's jaw tightened. "Mexican slavers raided our winter camp. Mourning Dove fought them, killed 2 before they shot her. I was hunting in the mountains, didn't know about the raid until I came back and found her body." Jane heard the pain in his voice, raw even after 3 years. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have asked." Tima shook his head. "No, it's good to speak of her. Keeps her memory alive. After she died, I tracked those slavers for 2 months. Found them one by one. Made sure they knew why they were dying." Jane was quiet for a moment. "Is that what you did to the Comancheros? Hunted them for revenge?" Tima met her eyes across the fire.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
"Partly, but also for justice. They killed innocents, took what wasn't theirs. Someone had to stop them." Jane nodded slowly. "Thank you for avenging Thomas and the others. I know you didn't do it just for me, but still. Thank you." Tima stood and added wood to the fire. "Get some rest. Tomorrow we'll try walking outside. Fresh air will help you heal faster." The next morning dawned clear and cold. Tima helped Jane to her feet, supporting most of her weight as they moved toward the cabin door. She was wearing one of his shirts, far too large for her, belted at the waist with a strip of rawhide. Her legs shook with every step, but she refused to give up. When they finally made it outside, Jane gasped at the beauty surrounding them. Pine trees stretched toward a brilliant blue sky. The stream sparkled in the morning sunlight. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still white with early snow. "It's beautiful," Jane breathed. Tima guided her to a fallen log near the cabin. "This valley is sacred to my people. We come here to hunt, to pray, to heal. The water in that stream comes from the heart of the mountain. It's always cold, always pure." Jane watched the water flowing past. "Why did you bring me here? To a sacred place?" Tima sat beside her. "Because it's safe. Because the spirits here are strong. I thought they might help you survive." Jane reached over and took his hand. Tima started at the contact, but didn't pull away. "They did help. Or you did. I'm not sure which." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the stream and the wind in the pines. Finally, Jane spoke again. "When I'm well, what happens then? Do we stay here? Do we go somewhere else?" Tima had been asking himself the same questions. "I don't know. If we stay in Apache territory, my people might not accept you. If we go to white settlements, your people will hate you for being with me. There's no easy path." "I don't need easy," Jane said. "I just need honest. If you want me to leave when I'm healed, say so. I'll find my way to California or Oregon, start over somewhere new. But if you want me to stay, if you meant what you said about being tired of being alone, then I'll stay. It's your choice, Tima. I already made mine when I asked you to come back for me." Tima looked at her, this white woman with her fierce green eyes and stubborn chin. She'd survived things that would have broken most people. She didn't flinch from hard truths or difficult choices. "I want you to stay," he said quietly. "But not because of some promise made in desperation. Stay because you want to. Stay because this is where you choose to be." Jane smiled, and it transformed her whole face. "Then I'm staying. Not because I have to, but because I want to." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and Tima felt something settle in his chest. Something that felt almost like peace. Over the next 10 days, Jane's strength returned steadily. She could walk without help, then began taking on small tasks around the cabin. Cooking, mending, gathering firewood from the pile Tima had cut. He watched her work, amazed at her determination. She never complained, never asked for special treatment. When the stitches in her side pulled and caused pain, she simply gritted her teeth and kept going. One afternoon, Tima returned from checking his snares to find Jane chopping vegetables for stew. Humming quietly to herself. "You're supposed to be resting," he said from the doorway. Jane looked up with a grin. "I've been resting for 2 weeks. I'm going mad just sitting around." Tima set the rabbits he'd caught on the table. "Your wound isn't fully healed yet." Jane put down the knife and lifted the side of her shirt, showing him the healing scar. The flesh was pink and new, but closed completely. "Look, no more stitches, no more bleeding." "I'm fine." Tima moved closer, examining the wound. His grandmother had taught him to read healing, to know when flesh was truly mending. Jane's wound looked good, clean and closed. His hand rested on her side, feeling the warmth of her skin through the thin scar tissue. Jane went very still, her breath catching. Tima suddenly realized how close they were standing, close enough that he could smell the pine soap she'd used to wash her hair. Close enough to see the pulse beating in her throat. He pulled his hand away as if burned. "It looks good. You're healing well." Jane's hand caught his before he could retreat. "Tima." He met her eyes, seeing something there that made his heart race. "I meant what I said. All of it. I'm yours." Tima shook his head. "You don't have to keep saying that. I'm not holding you to some promise made when you thought you were dying." Jane stepped closer, closing the distance between them. "I'm not saying it because I have to. I'm saying it because it's true. Because every day I'm here with you, I see the man you are. Kind, honorable, strong. You saved my life not once, but twice. You've taken care of me, protected me, asked for nothing in return. How could I not want to stay with you?" Tima's resolve wavered. He'd been alone for so long, had convinced himself he'd never feel this way about anyone again. But Jane was making it impossible to keep his distance. "I'm Apache," he said, as if she might have forgotten. "Being with me will make you an outcast among your own people." Jane laughed softly. "My people are dead, remember? I have no family left, no ties to the white world except bad memories. You are my people now. You in this valley and whatever life we build together. You might regret it," Tima warned. "Winter is coming. We'll be trapped here for months with only each other for company. You might get tired of me, might wish you'd gone to California instead." Jane reached up and touched his face, her palm warm against his scarred cheek. "Or I might wake up every morning grateful that you found me. That you didn't ride past that burned wagon. That you gave me a second chance at life." Tima closed his eyes, leaning into her touch despite himself. "Jane," he whispered. "I'm afraid." She understood what he meant. Afraid to love again. Afraid to lose someone else. Afraid that caring for her would somehow betray Mourning Dove's memory. "I know," Jane said softly. "I'm afraid too. But maybe that's okay. Maybe being afraid means we know how precious this is." Tima opened his eyes and looked at her. Really looked at her. This woman who'd survived impossible odds. Who'd offered herself to him without shame or hesitation. Who looked at him like he was worth something. He kissed her then, gentle and tentative, giving her every chance to pull away. But Jane didn't pull away. She kissed him back, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body pressing against his. The kiss deepened, 3 years of loneliness and grief melting away in the warmth of her embrace. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Tima rested his forehead against hers. "Are you sure?" he asked one last time. Jane smiled. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." That night, for the first time since Mourning Dove's death, Tima didn't sleep alone. Jane came to him not out of obligation or fear, but out of choice, out of desire. And as they lay together in the narrow cot, her head on his chest and his arms around her, Tima realized something profound. Saving Jane Langford hadn't just given her a second chance at life. It had given him one too. The lonely Apache warrior and the widowed settler woman had found something neither expected in this hidden mountain valley. They'd found home. They'd found purpose. And against all odds, in a world that would condemn them both for this choice, they'd found love. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines and the stream sang its eternal song. Winter was coming, and with it would come new challenges, new dangers. But for now, in this moment, they were simply two people who'd survived the worst life could throw at them, and somehow found each other in the aftermath. Jane fell asleep first, exhausted from her recovery and the emotions of the day. Tima stayed awake longer, watching the firelight play across her face, marveling at how quickly his life had changed. 3 weeks ago, he'd been a lone warrior with nothing but his horse and his rifle. Now he had a woman in his arms, a woman who'd chosen him despite everything that should have kept them apart. The weight of that choice, the responsibility and the gift of it, settled over him like a blessing. Morning Dove would have liked Jane, he thought. Would have appreciated her strength and her honesty. He'd loved Morning Dove with the fierce passion of youth, had thought that kind of love only came once in a lifetime. But what he felt for Jane was different. Deeper, perhaps. Born not from shared childhood, but from shared survival. From seeing the worst of each other and choosing to stay anyway. As Tima finally drifted off to sleep, his last thought was simple and true. He would protect this woman with everything he had. Would fight anyone, white or Apache, who tried to take her from him. Jane Langford had promised to be his. But somewhere in the past 3 weeks, without even realizing it, he'd become hers too, and that changed everything. Because now he had something to lose again. Something precious and fragile and worth fighting for. The question was whether the world would let them keep it, or whether their different skins and different worlds would tear them apart before they had a chance to build something real. Only time would tell. But as Jane stirred in her sleep and snuggled closer to his warmth, Tima made a silent vow. Whatever came, whoever tried to separate them, he would stand between her and danger. Just as he had when he found her dying in that burned wagon. Just as he would every day for the rest of his life, winter arrived early in the mountains, bringing snow that turned the valley into a white fortress. Tima and Jane settled into a rhythm of survival, working together to prepare for the long months ahead. He taught her to tan deer hides for warm clothing, showed her which roots and bark could be eaten when game was scarce. She taught him to read English from an old Bible she'd salvaged from the wagon wreckage, spelling out words by firelight while snow piled high against the cabin walls. By the time the first real blizzard hit, they'd stockpiled enough meat and supplies to last until spring. But something else was happening, something neither of them had anticipated. Tima was changing. Not in obvious ways, but in small, troubling signs that Jane noticed with growing concern. He'd wake in the night covered in sweat, gasping for air. During the day, he'd grow dizzy while chopping wood, have to sit down until his head cleared. Once, he collapsed while checking the snares, and Jane found him in the snow 20 minutes later. "It's nothing," he insisted when she helped him back to the cabin. "Just tired from working too hard." But Jane knew better. She'd seen these symptoms before, back in Missouri when her uncle had pushed himself too hard during harvest season. Exhaustion could kill a man just as surely as a bullet. "You need to rest," she said firmly. "Let me do more of the work." Tima shook his head stubbornly. "I'm the man. It's my job to provide, to protect you. And who protects you?" Jane challenged. "Who makes sure you don't work yourself to death, trying to take care of me?" Tima started to argue, but another wave of dizziness hit him. He sat down heavily on the cot, his head in his hands. Jane knelt in front of him, forcing him to meet her eyes. "Listen to me. You saved my life. You nursed me back from the edge of death. Now let me do the same for you. Let me help carry the load." But Taima's pride wouldn't allow it. He'd been a warrior his entire adult life, had never relied on anyone else for survival. The idea of letting a woman, even Jane, do the heavy work felt like weakness. So he pushed himself harder, rose earlier, worked later. He hunted in weather that would have sent sensible men back to shelter. Hauled water from the stream when the cold made his hands ache. Split enough firewood to last them 2 winters instead of 1. Jane watched him destroy himself and felt helpless to stop it. Every night he came back to the cabin, more exhausted than before. Every morning he forced himself up before dawn to do it all again. She tried reasoning with him, tried anger, tried begging. Nothing worked. Taima had something to prove, to himself if not to her, and he wouldn't stop until he'd proven it. 3 weeks into winter, during a particularly brutal cold snap, Taima pushed too far. He'd gone hunting before sunrise, tracking a buck he'd spotted near the ridge. The snow was waist-deep in places, the temperature well below freezing. He should have turned back, should have waited for better weather. But the buck represented meat for a month, and Taima's stubborn pride drove him forward. He tracked the animal for 6 hours through terrain that would challenge a healthy man. For someone running on no sleep and barely eating, it was suicide. He finally got his shot just before noon, dropping the buck with a clean hit to the heart. But as he bent to field dress the animal, the world tilted sideways. Taima felt his legs give out, felt himself falling. He hit the snow hard, his vision swimming with black spots. "Get up," he told himself. "Get up or you'll freeze." But his body wouldn't obey. The exhaustion he'd been fighting for weeks finally caught up with him. And Taima's consciousness slipped away like water through his fingers. Jane knew something was wrong when sunset came and Taima hadn't returned. He never stayed out after dark, always made it back before the temperature dropped with nightfall. She dressed in her warmest clothes, took Taima's rifle and a rope, and set out to find him. The snow was coming down harder now, erasing his tracks almost as fast as she could follow them. But Jane had learned tracking from Taima himself over the past month, and she could read the signs. Broken branches here, disturbed snow there, all leading up toward the ridge. She found him 2 hours later, unconscious in the snow beside a dead buck. His skin was gray, his breathing shallow. Jane's heart seized with terror. She'd seen men freeze to death before, knew what hypothermia looked like. Taima was dangerously close to that edge. She couldn't carry him, couldn't drag him through the deep snow back to the cabin. But she could keep him warm, could keep him alive until he regained consciousness. Jane built a fire using wood from dead branches and birch bark for kindling. Her hands shaking so badly she could barely strike the flint. Once the flames caught, she stripped off Taima's wet outer layers and wrapped him in her own blanket, then pressed her body against his, sharing her warmth. She fed the fire through the night, talking to Taima constantly, begging him to wake up, to open his eyes, to come back to her. "You promised," she whispered against his chest. "You promised to hurry back, remember? So hurry. Come back to me." Near dawn, Taima's eyes finally opened. He was confused at first, disoriented by the cold and the darkness, and Jane's tear-streaked face hovering over his. "What happened?" He croaked. "You collapsed," Jane said, her voice shaking with relief and anger. "You worked yourself half to death and then you collapsed in the snow. I found you just in time." Taima tried to sit up, but Jane pushed him back down. "Don't you dare. You're not strong enough yet, the buck," Taima said. "We need the meat." Jane laughed, but it sounded more like a sob. "The buck can rot for all I care. You almost died, Taima. Do you understand that? You almost left me alone in these mountains because you were too stubborn to admit you needed help." Tima saw the fear in her eyes, the way her hands trembled as they touched his face. He realized what his pride had almost cost them both. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I was trying to be strong for you." "You were already strong," Jane said fiercely. "You didn't have to prove anything. But now you're going to do something even harder than working yourself to death. You're going to rest. You're going to let me take care of things for a while. And you're going to trust me to be strong enough to carry us both." Tima wanted to argue, but he was too weak, too exhausted. For the first time in his adult life, he had to admit defeat. Had to acknowledge that he couldn't do everything alone. It took them most of the morning to make it back to the cabin. Jane had to support half of Tima's weight, stopping frequently to let him catch his breath. When they finally stumbled through the door, she guided him to the cot and covered him with every blanket they owned. For the next 3 days, Tima slept more than he was awake, his body finally getting the rest it desperately needed. And Jane did everything. She kept the fire going, melted snow for water, rationed their supplies, even ventured out to check the snares. On the 4th day, Tima woke feeling more like himself. Weak still but clear-headed. He watched Jane move around the cabin, efficient and capable, and felt something shift in his chest. She wasn't just surviving in his world. She was thriving, becoming part of it in ways he hadn't anticipated. "You went back for the buck," he said, noticing fresh meat hanging from the rafters. Jane looked over from the pot she was stirring. "Of course I did. You almost died getting it. Wasn't going to let that go to waste. How did you move it?" Tima asked. A full-grown buck weighed close to 200 pounds. Jane smiled slightly. "Cut it into pieces. Made 4 trips. Took me a whole day, but I got it done." Tima stared at her, this woman who'd been a pampered settler's wife just months ago. She'd butchered and hauled a deer by herself in freezing weather. Had tracked him through a blizzard and saved his life. Had kept them both alive while he recovered. "You're Apache now," he said quietly. More Apache than some who were born to it. Jane brought him a bowl of stew and sat beside the cot. "I'm just doing what needs to be done. Same as you've been doing since the day you found me." Tima ate slowly, savoring the rich broth and tender meat. "I was wrong," he admitted. "Wrong to push myself so hard. Wrong to think I had to do everything alone." Jane touched his hand. "We're partners now. That means we share the burden. You don't have to be strong every single moment. Sometimes you get to be the one who needs help." It was a hard lesson for Tima to learn. His whole life had been about strength, about proving he could survive anything. Asking for help, accepting weakness, felt like betrayal of everything he'd been taught. But as he watched Jane over the following days, saw her confidence growing as she took on more responsibilities, he began to understand. True strength wasn't about never falling down. It was about trusting someone enough to help you back up. By the end of the 2nd week, Tima was back on his feet, but changed. He no longer insisted on doing everything himself. When Jane offered to check the snares, he let her. When she suggested they take turns hauling water, he agreed. They became a true team, working together instead of him working and her watching. And something unexpected happened. Their bond deepened in ways that had nothing to do with the promise Jane had made or the gratitude they felt toward each other. One evening, as they sat by the fire mending clothes, Jane spoke without looking up from her sewing. "I'm happy here. Happier than I ever was in my old life." Tima glanced at her, surprised. "Even though we're trapped in a cabin all winter? Even though you have to work harder than you ever did before?" Jane smiled. "Especially because of that. In my old life I was just decoration. Something pretty to make Thomas look successful. Here, I matter. What I do matters. You need me, really need me, and I need you. That's worth more than comfort." Tima set down the leather he was working on. "I do need you. More than I thought I would. More than I wanted to, honestly. Jane finally looked up, meeting his eyes across the fire. Because you're afraid. Afraid that needing me makes you vulnerable. Taima nodded slowly. When Morning Dove died, I swore I'd never let anyone get that close again. Never give anyone the power to hurt me like that. But you're already that close, Jane. Already have that power. And that terrifies you, Jane said softly. Yes, Jane set aside her sewing and moved to sit beside him. It terrifies me too. Every time you go hunting, every time you're out of my sight, I'm afraid something will happen. Afraid I'll lose you the way I lost Thomas. But I'd rather be afraid and with you than safe and alone. Taima pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. When I woke up in the snow and saw your face, saw how scared you were, I realized something. I didn't just collapse from exhaustion. I collapsed because I was trying so hard not to need you that I nearly killed myself. And now? Jane asked. Now I'm trying to learn a different kind of strength. The kind that admits when it needs help. The kind that trusts someone else to be strong when you can't be. Jane kissed him softly. That's the hardest kind of strength there is. They sat together in comfortable silence, listening to the wind howl outside and the fire crackle in the hearth. The cabin felt smaller somehow, but in a good way. Like the walls were holding them safe instead of trapping them in. As winter deepened, they fell into new rhythms. Taima taught Jane to shoot his rifle, and she became good enough to bring down small game on her own. Jane taught Taima to cook more than just roasted meat, showed him how to make bread from the flour they'd saved and stew that didn't taste like leather. They told each other stories by firelight, about their childhoods and their losses, about dreams they'd given up and new ones they were building. One night, during a particularly fierce storm, Jane asked the question that had been on her mind for weeks. What happens when spring comes? Do we stay here? Go somewhere else? Taima had been thinking about the same thing. We can't stay. This valley is only safe in winter when no one travels. Come spring, Apache hunting parties will come through. Army patrols too. Someone will find us. Jane's hand tightened on his. Will your people accept me? Or will they see me as an enemy? Taima chose his words carefully. Some will accept you. Others won't. There are Apache women married to white men, white women who've been adopted into the tribe. But it's never easy. You'd have to prove yourself every single day. Jane nodded slowly. And the white world? Taima laughed bitterly. The white world will see me as a savage who stole one of their women. They'll want to hang me and rescue you whether you want rescuing or not. So where does that leave us? Jane asked. Taima stared into the fire, seeing their future reflected in the flames. There's Mexican territory south of here. Small villages where no one asks too many questions about a man and his wife. We'd be strangers there, but at least we'd be together. Jane considered this. We'd have to leave everything behind. Your people, my past, all of it. Taima turned to look at her. Is that something you could do? Leave it all behind for an uncertain future? Jane didn't hesitate. I already did that the day I asked you to come back for me. I chose you over everything else. Chose this life over any other I could have had. Taima kissed her then, deep and desperate, pouring everything he couldn't say into that kiss. All his fear and love and gratitude and hope. When they finally broke apart, Jane rested her forehead against his. We'll figure it out, together. Whatever comes, we'll face it the way we faced everything else. As partners, but as the storm raged outside and they held each other close, both knew the truth. Winter was a gift, a stolen season when the world couldn't reach them. But spring would come eventually, bringing with it all the dangers and prejudices they'd been hiding from. The question wasn't whether they'd face challenges. The question was whether their love would be strong enough to survive them. Whether choosing each other would be enough when the whole world seemed determined to tear them apart. For now, though, they had this. This cabin, this fire, this moment of peace before the storm. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all anyone ever really had. The present moment, held tight against an uncertain future. Outside, the wind screamed and the snow fell. Inside, an Apache warrior and a white woman held each other and pretended that winter could last forever. But both knew it couldn't. Both knew that when the snow melted and the streams ran high with spring runoff, they'd have to make choices that would define the rest of their lives. The only question was whether they'd make those choices together.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Or whether the world would finally succeed in pulling them apart. As Jane drifted off to sleep in Tima's arms, she thought about the promise she'd made in that burned wagon. She'd said she'd be his for as long as he wanted her. But somewhere along the way, that promise had transformed into something else entirely. Now she was his because she wanted to be. Because life without him seemed colorless and empty. Because he'd given her something she'd never had before. Not even in her marriage to Thomas. He'd given her a partnership built on equality and respect. He'd given her purpose and strength she never knew she possessed. Most of all, he'd given her love that didn't try to change her or diminish her, but instead helped her become more fully herself. And as sleep claimed her, Jane's last conscious thought was simple. Whatever came with the spring, whoever tried to separate them, she'd fight to stay by his side. Not because of a promise made in desperation, but because Tima had become her home in a way no place ever had. Tima lay awake longer, listening to Jane's breathing slow and deepen. He thought about Morning Dove, about the love he'd lost and the love he'd found. He'd been so afraid of betraying her memory by loving someone new. But he understood now that love wasn't a betrayal. Love was survival. It was the thing that kept you human in a world that tried to strip away your humanity. Morning Dove would have understood that. Would have wanted him to be happy, and he was happy despite everything. Despite the danger waiting for them in the spring, despite the impossible situation they'd created for themselves. He was happy because Jane made him remember what it felt like to be fully alive. Not just surviving, but living. Building something. Creating a future where before there had only been a past. As the fire burned low and the storm finally began to quiet, Tima made his own silent promise. He'd protect this woman and this love with everything he had. Would fight anyone who tried to take it from them. Would find a way to build a life together, even if the whole world said it was impossible, because some things were worth fighting for. And Jane Langford, with her fierce green eyes and stubborn heart, was worth fighting for. Winter had given them time to heal, time to build something real. Now they just had to figure out how to keep it when spring arrived and the world came calling. But that was a problem for another day. Tonight, they had each other and this cabin and the snow falling soft outside. And for now, that was more than enough. Spring came late to the mountains. But when it arrived, it brought more than melting snow and blooming wildflowers. It brought visitors. Tima spotted them from the ridge above the cabin. 3 Apache warriors on horseback, moving slowly through the valley. He recognized the lead rider immediately. Nantai, a warrior from his old band, someone he'd fought beside during the Apache Wars against the Mexican army. Someone who would recognize him just as quickly. Tima ran back to the cabin where Jane was hanging laundry to dry in the spring sun. "We have company." 3 Apache warriors, maybe 10 minutes away. Jane's face went pale, but she didn't panic. "What do we do?" Tima grabbed his rifle and checked the load. "You stay inside. Keep quiet. Let me do the talking." Jane caught his arm. "Will they hurt you? For being with me?" Tima's expression was grim. "Depends on what kind of mood they're in and whether they recognize me," He stepped outside as the three warriors entered the clearing. Nantali pulled up his horse, his eyes widening in recognition. "Taima, brother, we thought you were dead. No one has seen you since the winter snows." Taima kept his rifle lowered, but ready. "I've been here. Hunting, trapping, enjoying the solitude." Nantai's gaze moved past him to the cabin, to the woman's dress hanging on the line, to the smoke rising from the chimney. Solitude? That's not what it looks like from here. The other two warriors dismounted, circling around to get a better view. One of them, a young hothead named Kurek, laughed harshly. "You have a white woman in there. We can smell her soap, see her clothes. Have you lost your mind, Taima?" Taima's grip tightened on his rifle. "What I do is my business." Nantasi held up a hand, quieting Kurek. "Easy, brother. Taima is one of us. He deserves respect." But his eyes were troubled. "That said, having a white woman here, it's dangerous. For you and for our people. The army is already looking for excuses to push us further into the Badlands." "She's not going anywhere," Taima said flatly. "And neither am I." Kurek spat on the ground. "You betray your people for a white woman? After everything they've done to us?" Taima's voice went cold. "I betray no one. I saved a woman's life. That's what a warrior does. That's what honor demands." Nanta studied him carefully. "You love her." It wasn't a question. Taima didn't deny it. "Yes." The admission hung in the air like smoke. Nante was quiet for a long moment, weighing the options, considering consequences. Finally, he spoke. "The elders won't accept this. If you bring her to the main camp, there will be trouble. Some will call for her death, others for yours." Taima had expected as much. "Then we won't come to the main camp. We'll go south into Mexico. Start fresh where no one knows us." Kurek sneered. "Running away like a coward, typical." Taima's temper flared. "Call me a coward again and see what happens." Nanta stepped between them. "Enough. Kurek, go water the horses at the stream." The young warrior glared but obeyed, stalking off with his companion. Once they were out of earshot, Nantai moved closer to Taima. "Listen to me, old friend. Going to Mexico won't solve your problems. The Federals hate Apache as much as the Americans do. And lone couples, especially mixed ones, they're easy targets for bandits and slavers." Taima knew he was right, but had no other options. "What would you have me do? Give her up?" Nanta Fia sighed. "I'm not saying that. I'm saying think carefully about your path. There's a small band, led by Chief Cocheta, living in the Sierra Madre Mountains. They take in outcasts, mixed couples, people who don't fit anywhere else. It's not easy, but it's safer than going alone." Taima considered this. He'd heard of Cocheta, a wise leader who valued survival over tradition. "Would they accept us?" Nantai nodded. "I think so. Especially if I speak for you. Tell them how you saved this woman's life, how she's proven herself strong enough to survive an Apache winter." From the cabin doorway, Jane's voice rang out clear and steady. "I can speak for myself." She stepped outside, and all three men turned to stare. She'd braided her hair Apache style and wore buckskin clothing she'd made herself over the winter. She looked nothing like the dying settler woman Taima had found months ago. She looked like someone who belonged in these mountains. Nantai's eyebrows rose in surprise. "You learned our ways." Jane met his gaze without flinching. "I learned to survive. Taima taught me to hunt, to track, to read the weather and the land. I can skin a deer, tan a hide, shoot a rifle. I'm not a burden." Kurek had returned from the stream and laughed mockingly. "She thinks speaking a few words and wearing our clothes makes her Apache. She's still white. Still the enemy." Jane turned to him, her eyes flashing. "I never asked to be Apache. I only asked to live. Your brother Taima gave me that chance when he could have ridden past and let me die. That makes him a better man than you'll ever be." Kirek's hand moved to his knife, but Nanta stopped him with a sharp word in Apache. Then he turned back to Jane with new respect in his eyes. "You have fire in you. That's good. You'll need it where you're going." He looked at Taima. "Take her to Cocheta's band. I'll send word ahead. Tell them you're coming. But you need to leave soon. The army is pushing hard this spring, trying to round up any Apache they can find. And there are rumors of bounty hunters in the area, men who kill Indians for sport and money." Taima nodded. "We'll leave within the week." Nantai clasped his arm in the warrior's grip. "Be careful, old friend. The world is not kind to people like you too." After the warriors left, Jane and Taima stood in silence, processing what had just happened. Their peaceful winter isolation was over. The real world had found them, and now they had to make hard choices. "Are you sure about this?" Jane asked. "Going to this Chief Cocheta? Maybe we should still head to Mexico." Taima shook his head. Nantai was right. Mexico is too dangerous for just the two of us. At least with Cocheta's band, we'd have protection, community. Jane bit her lip, nervous. What if they don't accept me? What if I'm not Apache enough? Taima pulled her close. Then we'll figure something else out. But Jane, you need to understand something. From this moment on, our lives will never be easy. Every day will be a fight to prove ourselves, to earn acceptance. Are you ready for that? Jane thought about the woman she'd been 6 months ago. Pampered, sheltered, weak. That woman would have crumbled under such pressure. But she wasn't that woman anymore. I'm ready. As long as we're together, I can face anything. Taima kissed her forehead. Then we start packing. We leave in 3 days. Those 3 days passed in a blur of activity. They packed everything they could carry, cached supplies in hidden spots around the valley in case they ever needed to return, and said goodbye to the cabin that had sheltered them through the winter. On their last night there, they made love with a desperate intensity, both knowing that this simple happiness they'd found might never come again. Tomorrow they'd enter a world that didn't want them, didn't understand them, and would judge them at every turn. They left at dawn. Taima on his paint horse, and Jane on a sorrel mare he'd captured and gentled over the winter. They traveled south for 5 days, moving through terrain so rugged that Jane understood why the army had never successfully conquered these mountains. On the 6th day, they were met by scouts from Cocheta's band. 2 warriors who looked them over with hard, assessing eyes before leading them deeper into the Sierra Madre to the hidden camp. Chief Cocheta was an old man, maybe 70, with a face like cracked leather and eyes that missed nothing. He sat outside his wickiup surrounded by elders as Taima and Jane were brought before him. Nantai had sent word, but the chief wanted to hear their story directly. Taima told it simply, without embellishment. How he'd found Jane dying, saved her life, how she'd proven herself strong and capable through the winter. How they'd fallen in love despite everything that should have kept them apart. When he finished, Cocheta turned his attention to Jane. You are not Apache. His English was heavily accented but clear. No, Chief, Jane replied respectfully. But I'm not really white anymore either. I'm something in between. Something new. Cocheta's weathered face creased in what might have been a smile. Something new. I like that. Tell me, white woman who is not white, why should we accept you into our band? What can you offer us besides another mouth to feed? Jane had thought about this question during the journey. I can teach your women to read and write English. The white world is coming whether we like it or not. Your children will need to navigate that world. I can help prepare them. Cocheta's eyebrows rose. You would teach Apache children? Even knowing some of them might use that knowledge against your own people someday. Jane met his gaze steadily. My people are here now. With Taima, with anyone who will accept us. The past is dead. All I have is the future. One of the elders, a fierce-looking woman with white hair, spoke up in Apache. Taima translated quietly for Jane. She says you speak pretty words, but words are wind. She wants to know if you can work, if you're strong enough for Apache life. Jane nodded at the elder. Test me, give me any task. I'll prove myself. The elder smiled, showing gaps where teeth should be. She rattled off something in Apache that made several people laugh. Taima winced. She says you'll help the women butcher tomorrow's hunt. If you can keep up and don't complain, you pass. The next day, the hunters brought back 2 elk and a deer. Jane worked alongside the Apache women from sunup until well past dark, skinning, butchering, preparing hides for tanning. It was brutal work, and the women didn't make it easy for her. They gave her the hardest tasks, the messiest jobs, tested her endurance and her stomach. But Jane had learned from Taima that showing weakness was the fastest way to lose respect. So she worked until her hands were raw and her back ached, never once asking for rest or special treatment. By the time they finished, even the fierce elder woman looked impressed. She said something to the other women, and several of them laughed and nodded. One younger woman, maybe 20 years old, approached Jane and offered her a gourd of water. You did good, she said in broken English. Better than some Apache women I know. My name is Desba. Jane drank gratefully. Jane, or whatever name the tribe wants to call me. Desba smiled. We will call you Iskay. It means courageous woman. You earned it today. Over the next weeks, Jane slowly found her place in the band. She taught English lessons to the children in the mornings, worked with the women during the day, and spent evenings with Taima, learning more Apache customs and language. It wasn't easy. Some people still looked at her with suspicion or outright hostility. Kurik, who had also come to Cocheta's band, made his contempt clear at every opportunity. But others, like Desba and old Cocheta himself, treated her with growing respect. Taima, meanwhile, fell back into his role as a warrior. He joined hunting parties, stood guard duty, taught younger men how to shoot and track. But something was different now. He had Jane to come home to, a reason to be careful, to stay alive. The other warriors noticed the change in him. Some teased him about being tamed by a white woman. Others envied the obvious love between him and Jane. And a few, the older married warriors, understood exactly what he'd found. One night, 2 months after their arrival, Chief Cocheta summoned them to his fire. I have watched you both, he said without preamble. Watched how you work, how you treat each other, how you're fitting into our band. Taima and Jane waited nervously. I have decided, Cocheta continued, that you should marry. In the Apache way, before witnesses. Make your bond official. Jane's heart leaped. Taima reached for her hand. Chief, we would be honored. The ceremony was simple but profound. Jane and Taima stood before the entire band as the sun set, speaking vows in both English and Apache. They exchanged gifts, Taima giving Jane a knife he'd forged himself, Jane giving Taima a shirt she'd sewn with intricate beadwork. When it was done, they were officially married in the eyes of the Apache, their union blessed by the tribe. As drums beat and people danced around the fire, Jane felt something settle in her chest. A sense of belonging she'd never experienced before. But that peace was shattered 3 days later when Army scouts found the camp. Someone, possibly Kurik or another dissenter, had betrayed them. The army came at dawn with 50 soldiers and Pima scouts, surrounding the camp before anyone could escape. Chief Cocheta met them with dignity, refusing to run or fight against such overwhelming numbers. The soldiers rounded up every Apache, separating men from women, checking for wanted warriors. And then they saw Jane. Captain Marcus Wheeler, the officer in charge, stared at her in disbelief. What in God's name is a white woman doing in an Apache camp? Before Jane could answer, Tima pushed forward through the crowd of warriors. She's my wife. She's with me by choice. Wheeler's face hardened. Your wife? You kidnapped a settler woman and brainwashed her. That's what happened here. Jane stepped forward, her voice ringing with authority. No one kidnapped me. Tima saved my life after Comancheros killed my husband and left me to die. He nursed me back to health and brought me here. I chose to stay. Wheeler looked her over, taking in her Apache clothing, her braided hair, the confident way she carried herself. You've gone native. Lost your mind from the trauma. But don't worry, ma'am. We're taking you back to civilization. Get you cleaned up, send you back east where you belong. Jane's temper exploded. I belong here. With my husband. With these people who accepted me when I had nothing. Wheeler's expression turned pitying. Ma'am, he's not your husband. Whatever ceremony these savages performed, it's not legal. You're coming with us, and he's going to the reservation with the rest of them. Tima's hand moved to his knife, but Jane stopped him with a look. She turned back to Wheeler, her mind racing. Captain, I'm perfectly sane in making my own choices. If you force me to leave against my will, I'll make sure every newspaper from here to Washington knows how the Army kidnaps white women who dare to love outside their race. I'll make such a scandal that your career will be over before you make it back to the fort. Wheeler's jaw clenched. He hadn't expected resistance, hadn't expected this white woman to defend her Apache husband. You're making a mistake, he said coldly. These people are being relocated to the San Carlos reservation. Life there is hard. Many don't survive. You really want that for yourself? Jane moved to stand beside Tima, taking his hand. Wherever he goes, I go. That's what marriage means. For better or worse. Wheeler stared at them for a long moment, seeing the determination in Jane's eyes, the protective way Tima stood beside her. Finally, he shook his head. Have it your way. But don't come crying to the army when you realize what you've given up. The entire band was marched to San Carlos over the next 2 weeks. It was a brutal journey, and several elders didn't survive. When they finally arrived at the reservation, Jane saw immediately what she'd condemned herself to. Barren land, inadequate supplies, hundreds of Apache from different bands forced together in overcrowded conditions. It was a slow death sentence dressed up as government benevolence. But she'd made her choice, and she wouldn't regret it. That first night on the reservation, as they huddled together in a crude shelter made of canvas and scrap wood, Tima pulled Jane close. You could have left. Could have gone back to the white world. Why didn't you? Jane thought about the burned wagon where this had all started, about the promise she'd made. I told you then, and I'll tell you now. I'm yours. Not because I have to be, but because I want to be. This is my home now. You are my home. And I'll fight to keep that home, no matter where we are. Tima kissed her, tasting salt from tears he didn't know he'd shed. I don't deserve you. Jane smiled against his lips. Yes, you do. We deserve each other. And we'll survive this just like we survived everything else. Together. Outside their shelter, the reservation stretched out under cold stars, a prison with invisible walls. The life they'd built in the mountains was gone, destroyed by a world that couldn't accept their love. But as they held each other in the darkness, both knew that the fight wasn't over. It was only beginning, and this time, they weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting for the right to love across the lines their world had drawn. Fighting for a future where being together didn't mean losing everything else. It would be the hardest battle either of them had ever faced. But they'd face it the way they'd faced every challenge since that day in the desert. Side by side. Equal partners. Bound by love stronger than any promise made in desperation. The question was whether love would be enough. Whether two people, no matter how determined, could stand against the forces arrayed against them. Only time would tell. But as Jane drifted off to sleep in Tima's arms, she refused to give up hope. They'd survived impossible odds before. They'd do it again. They had to. Because the alternative, a world without each other, was unthinkable. And neither of them was ready to accept that fate. Life on the San Carlos reservation was worse than anything Jane had imagined. The government rations were barely enough to keep people alive, arriving late or not at all. Disease spread through the crowded camps like wildfire. Typhoid, measles, pneumonia. People who'd survived centuries in the harsh desert died from illnesses brought by the very government that claimed to be helping them. But Jane refused to break. She'd survived too much to give up now. She started teaching English to anyone who wanted to learn, convincing the reluctant Indian agent that educated Apache would be easier to manage. It was a lie, but it got her access to books and supplies. What she really did was teach the children and young adults how to navigate the white world that now controlled their lives. How to read contracts so they wouldn't be cheated. How to write letters to challenge unfair treatment. How to speak English well enough to be heard by those in power. Tima, meanwhile, worked with the other men on whatever jobs the reservation provided. Building fences, hauling supplies, anything to earn the pittance of money they were allowed. It was humiliating work for men who'd been free warriors, but Tima understood survival required adaptation. At night, he and Jane would lie together in their cramped shelter, planning for a future that seemed further away with each passing day. But they never stopped planning, never stopped hoping. 6 months into their reservation life, a visitor arrived that changed everything. Reverend Samuel Harrison from the Episcopal Church in Tucson. A man known for actually caring about the Apache people rather than just trying to convert them. He'd heard about the white woman living as an Apache wife and came to investigate. Jane met him with suspicion, expecting judgment or attempts at rescue. Instead, Harrison surprised her with genuine respect. "Mrs. Langford, or should I say Mrs. Tima?" he said with a slight smile. "I've heard remarkable things about you. Teaching children, helping the sick, standing by your husband despite tremendous pressure to abandon him." Jane studied him carefully. "What do you want, Reverend?" Harrison's expression grew serious. "I want to help. The conditions here are unconscionable. I've been writing to church leaders back east, documenting the government's failures. But I need witnesses, people who can testify to what's really happening. Would you be willing to help?" Jane glanced at Tima, who'd been listening silently. He nodded slightly. "What exactly are you asking?" Jane said. Harrison pulled out papers from his satchel. "I'm organizing a delegation to travel to Washington. Apache leaders, sympathetic whites, and if possible, someone like you. Someone who bridges both worlds and can speak to senators and congressmen in terms they'll understand. Your story, a white woman who chose to live among the Apache, who sees their humanity, it could make a difference." Tima spoke up in English, his voice cautious. "The government does not care what we say. They have never cared." Harrison nodded. "You're right to be skeptical. But things are changing slowly. There are people in Washington who want reform, who are horrified by what's happening on reservations. They need ammunition to fight the corruption. Your voices could be that ammunition." Jane considered this. It was dangerous, could expose them to even more scrutiny. But it was also an opportunity to actually make a difference. Over the next week, Jane and Tima discussed Harrison's proposal with Chief Cocheda and other respected members of their band. Some were against it, seeing it as pointless cooperation with an enemy that would never change. Others, including Cocheda, saw it as their only real chance to improve conditions. Finally, after much debate, they agreed. Jane would go to Washington as part of Harrison's delegation, speaking on behalf of the Apache people and their right to be treated humanely. But there was a catch. The journey would take months. Taima couldn't leave the reservation without permission, and that permission would never be granted to an Apache man. Jane would have to go alone, separated from her husband for the first time since they'd met. The thought terrified both of them. "I can't leave you here," Jane said the night before her departure. Taima held her close, his heart breaking. "You have to. This is bigger than us now. You can speak for people who have no voice. What if something happens to you while I'm gone?" Jane's voice cracked. "What if you get sick, or the soldiers decide to punish you for my actions?" Taima touched her face gently. "Then you'll grieve for me and keep fighting. That's what survivors do. That's what you taught me." Jane kissed him desperately, memorizing the feel of his lips, the warmth of his body. "Come back quickly," Taima whispered against her hair, echoing the words she'd said to him so long ago. "You know why," Jane laughed through her tears. "I'll hurry back. I promise." She left at dawn with Reverend Harrison and 3 Apache leaders, including a respected elder named Naish. The journey to Washington took 6 weeks by train and stagecoach, and every mile away from Taima felt like a knife in Jane's chest. But she channeled her pain into preparation, working with Harrison to craft testimony that would be both honest and persuasive. Washington, D.C. in 1878 was a city of marble buildings and political theater. Jane felt completely out of place in her borrowed dress and uncomfortable shoes, Apache ways still evident in how she carried herself. But Harrison had been right. Her story fascinated the Eastern establishment. A white woman who'd willingly become Apache, who spoke passionately about their humanity and the injustices they faced, made for compelling testimony. She spoke before the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs, describing conditions at San Carlos with brutal honesty. The inadequate rations, the disease, the corruption of Indian agents who sold supplies meant for the Apache and pocketed the money. She told them about children dying from preventable illnesses, about proud warriors reduced to begging for food, about families torn apart by a system designed to destroy rather than help. "Gentlemen," Jane said, looking each senator in the eye, "I know what you're thinking. I'm a white woman who's clearly been through trauma, who's defending her captors. But I wasn't captured. I was saved. Saved by a man who had every reason to hate white people, who helped me anyway because it was the right thing to do. That's the Apache way. Honor, courage, loyalty to family and tribe. Those are values Americans claim to hold dear. Yet we're destroying the very people who embody them better than we do." Her words created a stir. Some senators dismissed her as delusional. Others, particularly younger reformers, were moved by her testimony. Articles appeared in Eastern newspapers about the white woman who'd become Apache, about the love story that had led her to fight for her adopted people. Public opinion began to shift, slowly but noticeably. The delegation spent 3 months in Washington, meeting with anyone who would listen. It was exhausting, frustrating work. But gradually they made progress. Finally, they secured a meeting with President Rutherford Hayes himself. Jane stood in the Oval Office, wearing Apache jewelry over her white woman's dress, a living symbol of 2 worlds meeting. She told Hayes her story simply and directly, then made her request. "Mr. President, I'm not asking you to give the Apache their land back. I know that's impossible. But I am asking you to ensure they're treated with basic human dignity. Adequate food and medicine. Honest agents who don't steal from them. The right to maintain their culture while adapting to a changing world." Hayes listened thoughtfully. He was nearing the end of his presidency, and the Indian question had haunted his entire term. "Mrs. Langford, your story is remarkable. But you must understand the political realities. Many Americans see the Apache as dangerous savages who must be contained or eliminated." Jane's voice hardened. "Then many Americans are wrong. The Apache are people, Mr. President. They love their children, honor their elders, fight to protect their families. Just like white people do. The only difference is the color of their skin and the language they speak. Hayes was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he nodded. I can't promise miracles, but I can order investigations into the agents at San Carlos. I can increase rations and medical supplies. I can make it clear that corruption will not be tolerated. It wasn't everything Jane had hoped for, but it was something. A crack in the wall of indifference. She thanked the president and prepared to return to Arizona, to Tima, to the life she'd chosen. But when she arrived back at San Carlos 4 months after leaving, she found disaster waiting. Typhoid had swept through the reservation while she was gone. Dozens were dead, including Chief Cocheta. And Tima was missing. Desba met her with tears streaming down her face. He got sick 2 weeks ago. High fever, couldn't keep food down. The reservation doctor wouldn't treat him properly, said there were more important cases. Tima got weaker and weaker. Jane's heart stopped. Where is he? Desba's voice broke. He left 3 days ago. Said he wouldn't die on the reservation like a caged animal. Said if death was coming, he'd meet it in the mountains as a free man. Jane felt the world tilt. After everything they'd survived, after all the promises they'd made, Tima had gone into the wilderness to die alone. Which direction? She demanded. Desba pointed north. Toward the old valley. Where you spent the winter. Jane didn't hesitate. She took a horse, supplies, and her rifle, and rode out that night. The reservation guards tried to stop her, but she pushed past them, spurring her horse into a gallop. She rode through the night and into the next day, following trails she barely remembered, guided by instinct and desperate love. She had to find him. Had to reach him before it was too late. Come back quickly, she whispered to herself. I'm coming. I'm hurrying back. She found him on the 3rd day, in the valley where they'd spent their winter together. He'd made it to the old cabin, was lying on the cot where Jane had recovered from her bullet wound so many months ago. He was barely conscious, his skin gray with fever. Jane ran to him, falling to her knees beside the cot. Tima, I'm here. His eyes opened, confused at first, then filling with recognition. Jane, am I dreaming? No dream, she said, tears streaming down her face. I'm real. I'm here. And I'm not letting you die. She worked frantically, drawing on everything she'd learned from watching Apache medicine women over the past year. She built a fire, boiled water, made teas from herbs she found growing near the stream. She forced liquids down Tima's throat, bathed his fevered skin, stayed awake for 2 days straight monitoring his condition. It was typhoid, she was certain. The same disease that had killed so many on the reservation. On the 4th day, Tima's fever finally broke. He woke clear-headed for the first time, found Jane slumped beside the cot, asleep from exhaustion. He touched her hair gently, amazed that she'd found him, that she'd saved him yet again. When Jane woke, she found him watching her with those dark eyes she loved. You came back, he said softly. Jane smiled through fresh tears. I said I would. I said I'd hurry back. I thought I'd never see you again, Tima admitted. Thought I'd die alone on that reservation. Just another Apache who couldn't adapt to the white man's world. Jane took his hand. You're not dying. And you're not alone. You'll never be alone again. I promise you that. Tima pulled her close, holding her like she might disappear. What happened in Washington? Did they listen? Jane told him everything. About the meetings, the testimony, the promises President Hayes had made. It's not enough, she said. But it's a start. They stayed in the valley for 2 weeks while Tima regained his strength. Jane hunted, gathered food, nursed him back to health just as he'd once nursed her. It felt like coming full circle, like the universe had given them a chance to repay debts and reaffirm bonds. When Tima could finally stand and walk without weakness, they made a decision. They wouldn't go back to San Carlos. Couldn't go back to a place that had nearly killed them both. Instead, they would live on the edges, moving between worlds, helping where they could, but never again allowing themselves to be caged. It would be a hard life, always looking over their shoulders, never truly safe. But they'd be free. Free to love each other without shame or restriction. Free to be who they'd become, people who belonged to no single world but had forged their own path between two cultures. They settled in a small Mexican village near the border, a place where questions weren't asked and mixed couples weren't unusual. Taima worked as a guide and translator. Jane taught school to children of all backgrounds, Apache, Mexican, and white. They built a small house with their own hands, planted a garden, made friends with neighbors who accepted them for who they were. It wasn't the life either had imagined in their youth, but it was theirs years past. The Apache Wars finally ended. San Carlos Reservation slowly improved under new management, partly due to reforms pushed by Reverend Harrison and his allies. Jane and Taima visited occasionally, bringing supplies and news from the outside world. They watched children they'd known grow up, saw the Apache people adapt and survive despite everything stacked against them. And they told their story whenever anyone would listen. A story of love transcending boundaries. Of two people who'd found each other in the worst circumstances and built something beautiful. Jane never regretted her choice. Never wished she'd return to the white world when given the chance. She'd found something more valuable than comfort or acceptance from her own people. She'd found partnership, equality, love that saw her completely and valued her for exactly who she was. And Taima, the lonely warrior who'd thought his heart died with his first wife, learned that love could come twice in a lifetime. That saving someone could mean being saved in return. On their 10th anniversary, they returned to the valley where they'd survived that first winter. The cabin was still standing, weathered but solid. They spent a week there, remembering who they'd been and marveling at who they'd become. One evening, as they sat by the stream watching the sun set over the mountains, Jane spoke thoughtfully. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd ridden past that burned wagon? If you'd left me to die?" Taima considered this. "Sometimes. But then I remember something my grandmother used to say. The spirits guide us to where we need to be. I needed to find you as much as you needed to be found. We saved each other, Jane. That's the truth of it." Jane leaned against him, content. "Come back quickly, you know why," she murmured, quoting her own desperate words from so long ago. Taima smiled, wrapping his arms around her. "I'll hurry back," he replied, completing the promise that had started everything. They sat in comfortable silence as stars began to appear overhead. Two people who'd beaten impossible odds, who'd loved across boundaries that were supposed to be uncrossable, who'd built a life together despite a world determined to keep them apart. Their story wasn't simple or easy. It was messy and complicated and filled with sacrifice. But it was real. And it was theirs. And that made it worth everything. Years later, when people asked Jane if she'd made the right choice, she always gave the same answer. She'd look at Taima, at the life they'd built, at the bridge they'd become between two worlds, and say without hesitation, "I'd make the same choice 1,000 times over." Because love isn't about choosing the easy path. It's about choosing the right person and walking whatever path that requires, together. And Taima, hearing this, would take her hand and squeeze it gently. A silent affirmation of everything they'd survived and everything they'd become. In the end, their story became legend among both Apache and white communities. The warrior who saved a dying woman and the woman who chose to stay. It was retold around fires, passed down through generations, transformed into something almost mythical. But for those who knew the truth, for Jane and Taima themselves, it was never a myth. It was simply their life. Imperfect, challenging, but ultimately triumphant. A testament to what's possible when two people refuse to let the world define what their love can be. And somewhere in the desert, near a burned wagon that had long since turned to dust, the spirits that had guided them together smiled. Because sometimes in the midst of tragedy and loss, something beautiful is born. Sometimes from the ashes of one life, another rises. Stronger, fiercer, more determined to survive. That was Jane and Tima's gift to each other and to everyone who heard their story. Hope. The hope that love, real love, the kind that sees past skin and culture and history, can not only exist, but thrive. Even in a world that says it shouldn't, their cabin still stands in that hidden valley, a silent witness to the winter that changed two lives forever. And on quiet nights, when the wind whispers through the pines and the stream sings its eternal song, some say you can still hear them. Two voices, Apache and white, speaking words that bound them together across every divide. Come back quickly, you know why. I'll hurry back. I promise. Forever calling to each other. Forever finding their way home. The morning sun filtered through the curtains of their small adobe house, casting golden patterns across the wooden floor. Jane stood at the window, watching the village come to life below. A year had passed since they'd settled here, and the place finally felt like home. Not the desperate survival of the reservation, not the isolation of the mountain cabin, but a real home where they belonged, behind her. She heard Tima moving in the bedroom, the familiar sounds of him waking. But this morning was different. This morning, Jane had news that would change everything again. She turned from the window and walked back to their room, where Tima sat on the edge of their bed, pulling on his boots. He looked up at her and smiled, that rare, genuine smile he reserved only for her. "You're up early," he said. "Couldn't sleep." Jane sat beside him, taking his hand. "Tima, there's something I need to tell you." He turned to face her fully, reading the seriousness in her expression. "What is it? Are you sick?" Jane laughed softly, shaking her head. "No, not sick. The opposite, actually." She placed his hand on her stomach, still flat, but already carrying new life. "I'm pregnant." Tima went absolutely still. His dark eyes searched her face, looking for confirmation that he'd heard correctly. "A baby?" Jane nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. "Our baby. Due in about 7 months." For a moment, Tima couldn't speak. Couldn't process what this meant. He'd lost his first wife before they'd had children, had thought that chance was gone forever. And now Jane, his fierce, stubborn, beautiful Jane, was carrying his child. He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. Jane felt his shoulders shake and realized he was crying. In all their time together, through every hardship and danger, she'd only seen him cry once before. "Are you happy?" she asked softly. Tima pulled back to look at her, his face wet with tears but transformed by joy. Happy doesn't begin to cover it. Terrified, grateful, overwhelmed, yes. But mostly just amazed that life keeps giving us reasons to keep fighting. Jane wiped his tears away with her thumbs. "We'll be good parents. We'll teach our child both worlds, both languages. They'll be strong like you and stubborn like me." Tima laughed, the sound pure and unguarded. "God help us if they inherit your stubborn streak." They sat together, hands intertwined over Jane's stomach, imagining the future taking shape inside her. A child who would be both Apache and white, who would bridge the worlds their love had already connected. Later that morning, they walked through the village together, stopping at the small schoolhouse where Jane taught. Her students, a mix of Apache, Mexican, and white children, greeted her enthusiastically. They'd learned to love their unusual teacher, this white woman who spoke Apache and Spanish fluently, who treated everyone equally regardless of their background. Desba, who'd followed them from the reservation and now lived 2 houses down, met them outside with her own young son. "I can see it in your face," Desba said in Apache, grinning at Jane. "You're glowing. When is the baby coming?" Jane laughed, unsurprised that her friend had guessed so quickly. Spring, early spring. Desba hugged her tightly. This is wonderful news. Your child will be surrounded by love from two worlds. That's a blessing, not a burden. Taima nodded agreement, though Jane could see the worry still lingering in his eyes. She understood. A mixed-blood child would face challenges neither of them could fully shield them from. That evening, they sat on their porch as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Reverend Harrison had sent a letter that day, updating them on reservation conditions. Things were improving slowly. The corrupt Indian agent had been replaced. Rations were more reliable. The typhoid outbreak had finally been contained. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Lives were being saved because Jane had been brave enough to speak truth to power. Do you ever regret it? Taima asked suddenly. Giving up the life you could have had? You could be living in comfort somewhere, married to a respectable white man, accepted by society. Jane considered the question seriously. Sometimes I wonder what that life would have been like. But I don't regret my choice. That comfortable life would have been a cage, Taima. Pretty, maybe, but still a cage. Here, with you, I'm free to be exactly who I am. She placed his hand on her stomach again. And now we're bringing a new life into the world. A child who proved that love can cross any boundary. That's worth more than all the comfort and acceptance society could offer. Taima leaned over and kissed her gently. I love you, Iska. He used her Apache name, the one the tribe had given her. Courageous woman. I love you too, Jane replied. More than I ever thought possible. As darkness fell, they went inside to prepare dinner together, working in the easy rhythm they'd developed over countless meals. Tomorrow, Taima would guide a trade caravan through the mountain passes. Jane would teach her students and begin preparing for the baby's arrival. They'd live their lives facing each challenge as it came, supporting each other through whatever the future held. The burned wagon where their story began was long forgotten, dust scattered by desert winds. But what had risen from those ashes was more enduring than any single moment of tragedy. It was a love that had survived impossible odds. A partnership that had changed lives beyond their own, and now, a new generation that would carry forward the hope they represented. That night, as they lay in bed with Jane's head on Taima's chest and his hand resting protectively on her stomach, both thought about the journey that had brought them here. From that desperate moment in the desert to this peaceful evening, they'd traveled further than mere miles could measure. They'd crossed boundaries of culture and race and expectation. They'd defied a world that said their love was impossible. And they'd won. Not because the world had changed its mind about them, but because they'd changed themselves, become stronger and braver than they'd ever imagined possible. Because when Jane had whispered, "Come back quickly, you know why," and Taima had answered, "I'll hurry back," they'd made promises that went deeper than words. Promises written in survival and sacrifice and unwavering commitment. And those promises, kept faithfully through every trial, had built something unbreakable outside their window. The stars blazed across the night sky, the same stars that had watched over them in the mountain cabin, on the reservation, through every moment of their shared journey. And somewhere in the darkness, the spirits that had guided them together looked on with approval. Because this was how love was supposed to work. Not easy, not simple, but real. Built on choices made and kept, on promises honored, on two souls who'd found each other against all odds and refused to let go. In 7 months, their child would be born. And that child would grow up knowing that love, real love, could overcome anything. That courage meant choosing the hard right over the easy wrong. That home wasn't a place but a person, and sometimes, if you were very lucky, that person found you when you needed them most. Just as Jane and Taima had found each other. And just as they'd keep finding each other, every single day, for the rest of their lives.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.